My name is Maxine Most, and I'm really pleased to be here. I'm really excited to be hosting this panel at the inaugural edition of this event. My colleagues and I were just talking about how important an event we think this is, because we're really going cross-current on identity and looking across verticals and different technologies and coming together to talk about identity as opposed to those of us in the industry just talking about biometrics. So rather than focusing on technology, focusing on actually trying to solve a problem. And I just want to thank Travis and Dasha for putting this event together. I go to a lot of these, and this is, as far as I can tell, has been an incredibly well-run event. So I think these guys really deserve a lot of credit for that. So again, my name is Maxine Most. I have a company called Acuity Market Intelligence, and I've been at this biometrics game for quite some time. Acuity focuses on providing insight and analysis and strategic consulting in biometrics and related identity fields. So as you can imagine, I find it pretty amusing that people talk about this hot new biometrics market. I definitely think it's hot. I don't necessarily believe that it's new, as some of the gray hair on my head shows. At least two of the members on this panel I have known personally and professionally for 15 years. So we're going to have a great discussion, but I felt that because this is not a biometrics conference per se, that we want to really provide a bit of context for you about the industry. So I want to do what I would call a brief history of biometrics. And before I do that, I'm going to repeat an exercise that my colleague Peter O'Neill used this morning. If any of you were in the biometrics conference or the biometrics panel this morning, I just want to ask how many people here currently have a biometrically enabled smartphone on their body or in their pocket? Okay, almost everybody. Wait, keep your hands up. I'm not done. I have more than one question. How many of you use that biometric to unlock your phones? Keep your hands up. Okay, good. All right, panel. Wait, keep your hands up. I got two more questions. Now, keep your hand up if you use biometrics for some other application besides just unlocking your phone. Wow, that's pretty good. And so now one more thing. How many people use their biometrics at least 5 times a month? At least 10 times a month? Keep your hands up. 20 times a month? Okay, so this is really astounding. For those of you sitting in the room, it's probably not that astounding. If I'd asked that question 2 years ago, maybe half the hands would have been up. If I'd asked the question 4 years ago, probably none of the hands would have been up. And that is really amazing to those of us who have been around this industry for a while. It's a huge, huge change. And really, the Apple iPhone 5S has really heralded a new phase of the biometrics industry. And I like this slide because it demonstrates how rapidly that change has happened. We've basically gone from 0 to 500 different types of biometric smartphones that are currently available on the market. So just to kind of give you a brief history, biometrics, as I said, is not new technology. It started in the 1800s, essentially, when people figured out how to use fingerprints. Law enforcement began to use it really systematically in the earliest 20th century. In the 1960s and 70s, we had face recognition and eye recognition introduced as biometrics. And then we really had the first AFIS, which are the automated fingerprint identification systems. Those are the big fingerprint databases that law enforcement folks use, come into play really in the 80s, but not seriously take off until the late 90s. And during the 90s, we also saw movement towards using biometrics for more commercial and government applications. And 9/11 in particular created a whole new, not necessarily a new market, but a much more dynamic market and a much larger market for civil identification, e-passports, national IDs, visas, that sort of thing. What really fundamentally transformed the marketplace, and this is what really has created a new dynamic, and probably why you're all here, is the introduction of the iPhone 5S, which was really the first successful introduction of a biometric smartphone. Prior to 2013, there were other biometric phones that were available, but they were basically feature phones. So the smartphones biometric smartphones didn't really start till 2013. So this is, as I said, this is what's really changed the industry. And I think what's really interesting is the shift that we saw from a marketplace that was basically based on massive government adoption, limited commercial uptake, and negligible consumer market interest, to a market right now that is, to a large extent, being driven by the fact that consumers have biometrics on their phones, on their mobile devices, and they want to use them, and they want to use them for a lot of things. So for those of you who take this for granted, this idea of biometrics for granted, this is a slide that I introduced in 2007. Too much laughter, derision, and sometimes even abuse. I had people come up and get in my face. They were really angry that I was suggesting that this was the future of the industry. And it's really kind of funny, because this actually is now the future of the industry. So I don't think it's possible to underestimate the impact that mobility's had on biometrics. So I just want to show you a few more slides with numbers, and then we'll move on to the panel. This is the total number of biometric mobile devices that we're going to see in the next few years. It's really staggering. This gives you an idea of the kind of transaction volume that we're looking at with biometrics. These are big numbers. This is fundamentally game-changing tech. And essentially what we're going to do is we're going to move from the state where we are now, where we have, standard biometrics on smartphones, to eventually to a world of do-nothing biometrics, which to me means I pick up my smartphone and it recognizes me just because I'm picking it up, to the seamless integration of biometrics into our daily lives on many levels that we're not even going to know about. So this is the context for this conversation. I want to briefly introduce my panel members to you. I'm really excited to have these people here. And I'll start with Francis. Francis Zelazny. We've known each other for at least 15 years. We're two of the few women veterans of this marketplace. We've been around for a while. And Francis is a real brilliant market strategist. I would characterize her as basically continually being at the forefront of understanding the potential for biometric technology to really revolutionize government and commercial applications. And she is insightful and inspired and has consistently delivered results both as a senior executive and independent consultant. And she currently works for a company called BioCatch, which is doing some really cool behavioral biometrics. And she's their vice president of marketing. And next to Francis, we have Andrew Budd, who I'm going to skip for a moment, if that's okay. And then we have Toby Rush, who I'm going to skip for a moment, if that's okay. And then we're going to go to Conor White. I also have known Conor for almost 15 years. As we were talking earlier, we sort of have the gray hair or lack of hair to show for it. And Conor has an amazing, stellar reputation for really being a technical expert. He really understanding the implications of biometrics for IT. He's an inventor. He's got 13 patents in the biometrics area. And he is just a stalwart of this industry in many ways. He's been with Daon for a long time. How many years? 15 years? 18 years?
15 years.
15 years with Daon. And he's actually currently the president of the Americas and on the board. And I affectionately refer to Conor, even though he's not really, this isn't his focus these days, I affectionately refer to him as a standards geek. He's one of the people that really championed understanding that biometric standards are critical for the evolution of this marketplace. And then we have Toby Rush, who I've only known for 5 years, but that's like 20 years in biometric time. And Toby came into the industry with a mission to really make mobile biometrics work in 2012, when everyone thought he was crazy. And Toby hails from the technology hotbed of Kansas City. So that also really inspired a lot of questions about what this guy was doing. And I would say that mobile skeptics really dominated the market when Toby came into it. And I think now they're all questioning their skepticism because Toby's the CEO of EyeVerify, which was currently bought by Ant Financial, which is a subsidiary of the global giant Alibaba. So clearly he knew something that some of the skeptics didn't. And then finally, Andrew, I've just met recently, though he has been around mobile technology for quite some time. He's currently the founder and CEO of a company called iProov in the UK. And as I said, he comes from the mobile marketplace. He's got 20 plus years experience. And he was the founder, board member, and CEO of the world's largest provider of enterprise to consumer text messaging services, which now sounds kind of passé, but at the time that was also innovative, cool technology. And he currently serves as the global chair of the Mobile Ecosystem Forum, which is an international industry association which looks at the whole value chain. So this is an impressive group all around. And with that, we're going to start with some questions. So, and I'm not going to, you guys want to just jump in, feel free to jump in. This is a pretty talkative group, so hopefully we won't need a lot of prodding. So the first question I have is, just in the context of sort of understanding where this industry has come from, what do you think have been the biggest challenges for the biometrics market since the rather hyped kind of post 9/11 days? And how effectively do you think the industry has met the opportunities and that really, or addressed the opportunities and met the challenges that it's faced?
As chief jumper in and as the latest entrant to this market, I have a slight outsider's view. So I was one of the builders of the European mobile industry. I knew nothing at all about biometrics and not very much about identity until about 2012. Some would argue I don't know too much about it now. When I came into this market, it was obvious that biometrics were the future. And so we blundered with enormous enthusiasm into banks, healthcare organizations, all sorts of enterprises, confident that biometrics, that they were just aching to use biometrics because of its undoubted quality. And after a while, we realized that that as soon as we opened our mouths, the room was filled with an antique smell. That what was happening was that we were touching upon an ancient nerve, that somehow we were coming in on the back end of a really foul reputation, that something had happened way before our arrival in the market that had poisoned the reputation of biometrics for a long time. And that what we didn't realize was that when we walked out of the room at first, the guys who we'd left behind went, ha, 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 look at these guys. They think they can sell biometrics to us. We'd have to be mad to buy that. Something dreadful seemed to have happened to the reputation of biometrics in the mid-noughties, which was still hanging around until about 2 or 3 years ago. And the combination of a new generation of technology, of Touch ID, and just the march of time finally seems to have blown that smell away. And now, actually, we've got a real market ahead of us. But it's a very strange thing to walk into a place which has recently been poisoned.
So I'll add a bit of history to answer the question. I think that the biometrics industry was born out of technology and coolness. And in many ways, we used to talk about this a lot, that it was technology looking for a problem to solve, or trying to stick technologies into places where they may or may not fit. And I think the industry has matured over time into more of a solution-oriented approach. That being said, I think beyond the government space, in the very large commercial environments, the industry has suffered from how to overcome the existing infrastructure challenges and adapt to existing environments in order to solve real problems.
And I would just add, as the other 15 years person, so I was around in the time you're talking about. For me, the biggest disappointment at the time was to see all these vendors coming out making outlandish claims. And it was particularly troublesome in the wake of 9/11, which people thought would spur the biometrics industry. And then you had all these companies coming out saying, well, if you'd used our stuff, that wouldn't have happened, which is not true. There was claims around false accept rates, false reject rates, things that are complicated, but people didn't understand. And for a period of time, there was a lot of hype, and then there was a trough of despair, to use the Gartner term, as people realized that you can't get there, right? There is no perfect security. There never will be. And anybody that tells you there is either lying, stupid, or both. And so now we begin to realize that there's layers, we make it better as we go forward. So for me, in the last couple of years, I've seen a balance come to the market where people are talking about multi-factor authentication. They're talking about platforms that enable innovation. We talk about innovation at authentication. So changing the game from, if you go through security today at an airport, for example, is stop, show me all your stuff, and then you can pass. You're starting to see the world move towards more probabilistic, more ongoing, continuous authentication. And I think that's a much better approach. I think we're getting away from the outlandish claims made by device manufacturers, algorithm manufacturers. There's no silver bullet in biometrics, same as there's no silver bullet in security. And I think the change I'm seeing in the industry is people beginning to actually embrace that model and move it forward.
Yep, I would agree with all of these folks. The only addition that I would make is just the capacity that we find in the mobile devices, right? The sensors that are always with us, the compute power that's always with us, the connectivity back to the server and the applications that we're accessing on device, I think changed the game from surveillance to security. Right? So biometrics for a long time was about surveillance. And as we moved to security on mobile, both the need went way up, the pain point went way up, but also the capacity to solve that problem using kind of devices that we purchase on our own and we upgrade every year to 2 years. Is really kind of like what opened it up, and Touch ID, probably no better example than that. And now you see the number of fingerprint devices is play the most blatant example.
So as we kind of move on from a bit of the past, I always find it sort of interesting to kind of do a exhalation about what problems you had in the past, so we can talk a little bit about where we are now and moving on to the future. So, as I mentioned in the presentation, Toby just touched on it, the introduction of Touch ID was really a tipping point in the industry in a serious way, and it really heralded what I consider to be a new age, a new era of biometrics. And all of these people here on this panel have some experience in that mobile realm. So I wonder, when you talk about where we are now, like, how do you characterize the era that we're in, if you will? What do you think have been the most significant accomplishments or advancements really since Touch ID was introduced in the last 3.5 years? And so what are the challenges relative to that shift that we're seeing right now?
Maxine, could I cut across you just 1 second? Because there's one question which I think associated with that, which we need to address, is why does anyone in this room care? Why are you all sitting here talking about biometrics? I think this is the most important session of the entire conference, because this whole conference is about identity, and identity is about being able to assert attributes repeatedly about the same person. And identity is meaningless if it isn't the same person appearing time after time. Well, the only way in which you can determine that it's the same person, the basic fabric of an identity, is authentication. Because otherwise, different people can present and the whole thing is destroyed. A lot of the conversation that's been going on in different parts of this conference have all been about the device. So actually, there's been a lot of discussion about how in future we won't have identities at all. Our handsets, our mobile devices will have identities, and we will be merely appendages of our mobile devices. That actually, identity will belong to this, not to me. Now, that's not okay. So the only way in which we can genuinely assert in a repeatable, persistent, reliable, and secure way our own identities will be via biometrics. In my view, there is no other secure way. In the old days, we used to do it by means of something we know, but the current era of cybersecurity, and this returns to your message, Maxine, the current world of cybersecurity, which doesn't look like the world of cyber attacks, that doesn't look like the world of 5 years ago, has now made something an untenable way of asserting your identity. So biometrics are the only way in which you can actually, it's the only foundation upon which you can build a digital identity. That's why we're all here. This is the centerpiece of the entire conference.
So given that, so where are we now today with the early post iPhone 5S?
We're in a room with 40 people instead of 400.
Okay, so
I'll say that I think where we are is that there is, just by virtue of all the hands that were raised before, I think that there is a much broader acceptance of biometrics in general. Back to what Conor was saying, in the post 9/11 days, it was this was the silver bullet on the one hand, and then on the other hand, this was the scariest thing that ever could be. I think in general we're past that, just because we all touch it every single day. But I think there is still, and we see this at BioCatch, there is still a false perception that when you authenticate yourself one time, that then you are protected for the duration of the session or for the future in whatever way you're transacting with that particular organization. And I think that needs to change. And I think people need to recognize that the real threats go beyond just the logon or just, the touch. And there needs to be ways to create persistent authentication, continuous authentication, and carry that concept throughout whatever you're doing or the way when you're interacting. If it's a hospital, if it's a bank, if it's an employer-employee relationship, this has to go beyond now. It's not just a one-time thing.
Yeah, and I think I completely agree. I think the stuff that Daon's doing, kind of providing a platform where it's not just a single point of entry with a fingerprint, right? And the stuff that BioCatch does for continuous. I think where we're evolving is a more holistic understanding of projecting my identity into the digital world, but using a lot of different ways to do that. My finger could be my face, could be my eye, could be the way that I'm interfacing with the device, and then platforms, again, like Daon, that is able to package those together. So I think your question, where has Touch ID started, which is awesome. They kind of consumerized the concept of biometrics and made it accessible and made it friendly. And I think where we're going now is really that usability layer, right? So making it really seamless, really invisible to the user, but yet maintaining this high level of security and confidence of who's holding that phone, who's interfacing with the application.
I agree with everything. I think we're at a point where, as a software engineer, I presume there's a few more of us in the audience, classically trained, you were either more convenient or you're more secure, but you couldn't be both, right? So security meant lots of friction. And if you wanted a friction-free process for your customer, it meant no security. And biometrics puts the person back in the transaction. And quite frankly, if it's just you in the transaction, friction goes away. Because all the things that we do today in the guise of security are because we don't know who's actually using the device. So we'll send you an SMS code, we'll send an email, or we call and we'll ask you for the last 4 of your social and your mother's maiden name, and it goes on and on and on, because you don't know who I am. But if you put the person back in the transaction, it becomes very easy. And so, we've all used Touch ID. It's convenient. If you look at what everybody here has different technology. If you look at what Toby and the team are doing with Iris, with Eye and Face, it's simple. There's not a person on the planet today that can't take a selfie, right? I have 3 boys, and it's the first thing they do every morning is take an Instagram or something and send it to their friends. It's so easy to do. So we're actually changing the paradigm. I'm actually fascinated by the fact that we're actually beginning to increase security and decrease friction. And I think that allows us to create trust online. And if you look at the evolution of humans, as my son, 17-year-old, who's becoming a philosopher, was telling me, humans evolved because of trust. It was you trusting the people in your village. It was your butcher trusting the people to pay him later on. But without trust, we have no framework for cooperating. Without cooperation, we have no framework for growing up as a species. And digital is new. Physical has been around for millions of years. The digital paradigm is new, and we're finally starting to learn what it means to create trust online. And it's not passwords, as you all can see from recent news. It's about putting that person somehow back into that transaction and then doing it on an ongoing and continuous basis.
Can I ring in a bell, though? Because there's one thing that was just said that I do disagree with. Easy is absolutely fundamental. In fact, if security isn't easy, it isn't secure. Frictionless can mean not demanding any effort, but frictionless sometimes is taken to mean invisible and instant. I actually increasingly disagree that you want security, you want authentication to be invisible. There are a number of different data points that suggest that if you make it invisibly easy and quick and almost invisible to get into really sensitive data, or to pay people a lot of money, or to do things that matter, it scares the bejesus out of people because they think that they're not being protected. It's essential to make it easy, but you need a moment of ceremony. So this word frictionless can sometimes mean low cognitive load, but it can sometimes mean zero ceremony. And I think zero ceremony security will increasingly be rejected by consumers.
So he did say beforehand that he was going to start an argument, so he's doing it. I didn't say invisible, I said frictionless, right? So they're different. And so for me, it's about being able to quickly access my bank account. I'm on my mobile phone, I'm boarding an airplane, I want to see have I money in my account when I land to buy a toy for my kid, or I want to approve some expenses for some of my team. It doesn't mean that it's doing it before I make the decision to do so, but I need to be able to do it quickly. And I don't want to have to go fish out a token, type in some 8-digit number into another device, get it wrong, wait, that's friction to me.
Another example of friction is if you're trying to shop online and you're not in your normal location and they reject you because you're in the wrong place and the standard fraud protection measure doesn't see your device in your home. So you're just going to abandon the transaction. That's another form of friction. So I think it has to be looked at, as a whole thing. It's not only the user wanting to feel protected, it's also what they're trying to achieve at that particular moment. And if things like tokens or device ID or geolocation, whatever it is, are making it hard for the person to do whatever they need to do, they're just not going to do it. And I think back to the comment on infrastructure, I think that's one of the things that have hindered biometrics from being pushed out in financial services or in healthcare in the masses, because it hasn't necessarily, that friction element hasn't yet completely gone away.
Could I add just one data point, which I think reinforces exactly what you're saying? I saw, I think it was a year ago, a Javelin report, MasterCard and Javelin, it was from both MasterCard and Javelin, and it talked about card not present e-commerce transactions. And in 2014, I think it was, the fraud rate for card present, if you're familiar, your physical world transactions with cards was $9 billion. That's with a B. That's a big number. It's a huge number. The number for lost revenue because of declined transactions, because people abandoned their shopping cart or they were trying to prove who they were, but the system said, no, you're too high risk, we don't know who you are. That number was $118 billion. Yep. Okay? That's 13 times. So friction resulted in 13 times lost revenue than gross revenue than fraud did. So is it a security problem? Or is it a convenience problem? Or is it actually both? And biometrics is the one technology that's out there today that allows you to solve both.
Okay, I'd like to move on, because one of the things that I really wanted to address today, and we're sort of touching on it a little bit because there's a lot of focus on mobile devices, and that makes a lot of sense, and particularly post iPhone 5S world that we're in now. There's a lot of conversation going on about on-device versus cloud-based authentication. Right, we have examples of both, and we have some staunch advocates on both sides of that argument. So and it can be contentious at times. So I'm wondering just what you guys think about this whole construct of cloud versus, or network versus device-based authentication for biometrics. Who's jumping in?
I'll go first. I mean, I would say I've grown a little bit in this space. I used to be very staunch device only, right? Because I think there's a lot of benefit and strength that come from device. The longer we've been in the market, in particular, probably our experience in Asia and Southeast Asia has helped me understand the need and the benefit of sometimes having a server-side component. So I think it is, I guess I'm moving more to the centrist in which one is better. I think there are, and maybe a part of my evolution of my understanding is a difference between where my biometric is stored and how my keys are managed. Right? I think there's a lot of concern about, well, if somebody gets my image that was my biometric image, all of a sudden I'm screwed forever. And that's just really not the case, right? And people don't quite understand that. And if you really dive into it, there's something to be said if you have your private key is stolen and that key can't be revoked easily. Now that poses a much larger security risk. And so I think especially as we've looked at some of the Southeast Asia and Asia use cases and customers that we have, I like in general, normal device side, normal verifications could happen locally, but there are times either for step up or for new device provisioning where server side makes a lot of sense. So I guess it is a little bit of both.
So I'm not going to be quite so moderate. I have strong and quite controversial views on this. And it depends a bit upon the biometric, to be fair, and it also depends upon the use case. If you're trying to access your phone, if you're trying to open the phone, then clearly it's got to be device side because you may not be connected to the network. But if you're trying to assert an identity, if you're trying to authenticate into the network to do something that matters, and if you're dealing with face biometrics, which is what we like, because face biometrics are the most usable biometric, you look at your device, it looks back at you, it don't get easier. It couldn't be easier. then any service, any device-side component is toxic. You're creating an extremely dangerous and unsustainable security environment if you do anything, and especially the spoof detection on the device. Maxine, if you give me 30 seconds, I'll justify that statement. Your face, there's nothing private about your face at all. The idea that your face credential risks being stolen is laughable. You just go to LinkedIn, get my face off that. So the face is a public credential. The core of security for face biometrics and some others is your ability to detect spoofs and replays. Not your credential, your ability to detect a forged credential. And that's an attack. That is where the attackers will attack. If you put that defense upon the device, then you've given the attackers an unlimited, unobserved, unmodified laboratory with which to explore your vulnerability surface, and they will succeed. It is a mathematical certainty that they will break you. A number of us are here have experimented with this. Normally it takes us between half an hour and half a day to break a device side, to spoof a device side face recognizer. And once it's broken, it's permanently broken. The supplier of that technology doesn't know it's been broken because it's device side. So what you've just generated is an invisible, undetected, irresolvable zero-day exploit. And that's simply inexcusable. And you can't get away from that. The key defense for many biometrics, including face, is the spoof recognition, is the spoof detection, which is actually intimately bound up with the credential check. And that must be done safely, where it can safely away from prying eyes, in the servers, where it can be observed, where it can be monitored, detected, and changed in response to new security threats. Any other consideration is secondary. People say, oh, well, they could steal the face if it's in the center. As I say, just go to LinkedIn. It's much less trouble. The key then is to make sure that the mechanisms for spoof prevention are sufficiently robust and sufficiently opaque and sufficiently difficult for the attackers to experiment with, that they cannot find a sustainable way of attacking it. And you cannot do that on the device.
Connor? You're chomping to get in, I can see, on that end.
No, I have maybe a more moderate view. I look at this as it's religious wars, right, as we were saying earlier. I mean, you have your people who are very much device-centric, you have people who are very server-centric, and I think it really depends on the circumstances. It depends on the use case. If you, for example, are just opening up an app, then perhaps doing it all on device is fine, right? I mean, so it doesn't have to be, again, silver bullets, there's no such thing. So we need to stop talking in terms of absolute terms. As a bank, for example, or government, if I'm focused on collusion as my main use case, then server makes more sense, because Toby and I could be buddies, and I could say, hey, I'm going out of town, can you take care of all these funds transfers? And he goes, well, I don't have your device. Well, here's my device, and here, put your fingerprint in. Well, there's my PIN. So the collusion use case doesn't work if I'm allowing somebody else to collude with me and add their biometrics in. For that, you need a server generally. So the model we adopt, or I look at it, is you got to identify the point where the authentication takes place at a point in your network that you can trust against the risk level associated with it. So if you can leave trust at the edge, then you can do that. If you've got something that requires $1 million transfers and collusion's a big problem, then you do it on the server. And so for us, it's a continuum. And by the way, you could do both. You could do liveness on the server, on the device, matching on the server, or do liveness in two places if you're really worried. So the edge doesn't matter. To me, it's the network. Back to the old Sun Microsystems, I'm showing my age. The network is the computer, but the network is the authentication, right, layer. And so you can do it on the device or you can do it on the server. It's really up to you and the use case in question. I do agree, however, that liveness is, if you ask me what's the big challenge today in the industry, it's not getting an extra 0.01% equal error rate or false match rate. It's liveness. The single biggest challenge we have is liveness. Even though we bind, and there's an expectation around that, there's a marketing element to it as well as an actual real-world element. Generally, you bind your identity to the device, so there's a crypto key involved, so you actually have to steal somebody's phone in the first place, or their hardware token. But even then, so you've got that element to break, and then you've got the issue of liveness. And again, there's no silver bullet. There's some companies have great liveness technology. EyeVerify has some great stuff that's there today and coming. iProov has some great stuff. Lots of companies have great liveness technology, and what you're going to see over the course of the next 2 or 3 years is the dramatic advances we've seen in biometric accuracy, we're going to see that in liveness. And again, that's the platform play. That's the ability to innovate as you authenticate. And authentication is not just matching, it's the liveness checking, it's the continuous verification on an ongoing basis. And so it's a great journey we're on, and I'm excited to see the technology coming.
So just playing off something that you mentioned, because I think this is really important when we start talking about device versus server-based biometrics, there's the issue of privacy comes up and data control. And obviously there's been a lot of discussion about this over the last day and a half about person-centric identity or sovereign control, sovereign identity that we've been hearing about. So what I want to know is are these discussions about privacy and data protection and ownership, are those boons or busts for biometrics? You want to start, Francis?
So I'm going to add a comment to the last question and then weave in. So what BioCatch does is we focus on detecting anomalies within sessions to prevent account takeover. That's one of the main use cases for behavioral biometrics. And one of the very interesting things that we saw in Europe is that as the technology was deployed in websites, the fraudsters went to the mobile. And if you just had authentication on the device, then it would be almost impossible to detect rats on the mobile and account takeover on the mobile and device spoofing of the mobile. And so I think that it's really what the real world situations are showing is that it's not a one size fits all, and you need to consider what the fraudsters are actually doing today. It's unlikely that they're going to steal your phone and log into your bank account using your phone. It's more likely that they will trick you into somehow downloading malware onto your device and then remotely piggybacking on your existing login to do whatever they want to do. And so from that perspective, the whole notion of identity and authentication and even liveness gets a whole new added dimension. Now back to privacy, the protection of your assets at the bank account is just as important to you and the bank as the notion of privacy per se. So it's there has to be a balance between how the biometrics are deployed, and this goes back many, many years as well, responsible use guidelines for storing, using, where the encryption, data retention, and the responsibility lies. And I think that today there are some good frameworks already with even GDPR and some of the guidelines here where there's a clear legitimate interest and use for fraud prevention and criminal detection versus just using biometrics for advertising or marketing purposes. And so I think that balance needs to continue to be maintained.
So, Toby, do you think it's a boom or bust?
And specifically kind of the context around privacy?
Yeah, I mean,
just
the data
concerns?
protection and privacy
Sure.
and big data and all of these issues around, PII. Do you think that, do you think that basically makes it harder for biometrics, or do you think that actually biometrics has a role to play in solving those problems?
I think that it has a role to play, right? So the idea that PII means is it's information that's relevant to me, right? And the best way to protect my information, my identity, is with my own biometrics. So really, I think biometrics have a very strong play in that. I'll also say that we talk a lot about use cases, with banks and healthcare, and a lot of these are some very first world problems. Again, some of my eyes have been opened is, biometrics are enabling companies to open new accounts, people to open bank accounts, the unbanked, the underbanked, and kind of an Asian, Southeast Asian. The benefits are staggeringly larger than the small potential risk of privacy, right? And so we spend a lot of time, I think, splitting hairs. And they're important discussions, and we need to figure out the right framework and what is kind of responsible data collection, data retention, data management. So it's important. Even in that context, I think, at the end of the day, I own my own information, and I own my own biometric. So privacy is much more of a boon than a hindrance.
Okay. Can I just ask if there are any questions in the audience, because we're going to be running out of time soon, and I want to make sure if anybody has a question they can ask. Yes, sir.
If you have to make an analogy between biometrics and
That's a very interesting question. The question is a biometric like a username or like a password? My view is Touch ID as a username, iProov as a password.
What was the password? The what?
It's iProov, that's us.
It's the facial recognition.
Strong spoof-proof
technology.
face verification.
Connor?
I would say neither, because neither represents me. Biometric is me. So you can type my username in and be me online. You can type my password in and be me online, but my biometric is me. So I ask people all the time, does your password define you? And everybody says no. And I said, well, give it to me and give me 20 minutes and I'll redefine you online. That's all it'll take. So I would argue it's different. And this is the problem we have with biometrics, because for the longest time we've had things that are simple like username and password, and we have cryptography, which is easy to understand as well. They're both deterministic. My username matches, my password hash matches. The crypto, you take the crypto key and you take the plain text, you get the same ciphertext. That's deterministic. Biometrics are probabilistic, so they're actually fundamentally very, very different. And so with respect, I just can't put them into either one or the other. They're actually, it's a new, I hate to use the word paradigm because that's the most overused word in technology, so forgive me, but it is a different way of doing things.
It's the classic example that a password or username is something that you know, a token is something that you have, and a biometric is something that you are.
But actually, the question is a good one. Sorry, in reality, you can't class a password a username. A biometric is not a username, because by definition, a username is a single, unequivocal point in a namespace. A biometric is never a single point in a namespace. Different biometrics have different degrees of overlap. You know, frankly, I look like probably 100,000, maybe 500,000 other people in the world. EyeVerify's eyes will look like a smaller number of people in the world, but we are not, no biometric is a single unequivocal point in a namespace. That's why you don't try and recognize people. What we're very good at is authenticating, confirming the assertion of a point in a namespace.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes, right here, I'm sorry. Yes, everything, the whole world, according to David Birch, is solved by the blockchain.
We are a block.
So is it federated, or is it every, like my bank, or is it iProov, or who is keeping the original copy?
Would you forgive me if I answer? It's a very simple question. The answer is, if somebody is an identity issuer, then it's held by the identity issuer. But in most modern cases, it's the service provider, it's the bank, it's the health organization that is the issuer, and therefore that credential is only associated with that username within that service provider. And if that same biometric appears in two different domains, woe betide you if you link them together, ever without permission.
Okay, Conor, you want to jump in?
So you bring up maybe you're not going there, maybe you are, but it's a conversation that for over 10 years now, when I present, I often start off with a slide that says, identity is the new money, okay? I see David Birch actually is using it in a book since.
Did he give you credit for that?
Well, I actually don't know where, no, I don't think he did, but he doesn't need to, because I think a number of people have been using it.
So you stole it from
so
somewhere else, okay.
No, I don't think so, but I didn't steal it from somebody else. I had their permission, but I don't know if they stole it from somebody else. But if you think about it, today I don't give money. If you go back 100 years, I would have money with the mercantile and credit. I would have money at the sawmill. I'd have money at the livery stable for my horses, right? I mean, you had credit one-to-one. We don't do that anymore. I bank with a bank or two banks, and then they establish a network where these merchants, these providers of service, rely on them to pay me, and then they authenticate me as part of that, and they manage my money. We have the opposite problem with identity online today. I'm giving my identity to Google. I'm giving it to Apple. I'm giving it to, well, I don't give it to Facebook, but I'm giving it to, Microsoft. I'm giving it to my company. I'm giving it to a ton of people. I'm proliferating my data. And we talked about earlier, Toby made the point that his biometrics are private to him, and that's good, and that's the right way. But today, with passwords and usernames, we're proliferating it, and we need to adopt a model where only I can authenticate my data, and somebody that I trust does that. So there's a great business, and there's been a great business for 20 years, for an identity provider to work together with these other parties to create that bank, that identity bank. I worry more about, I bank with USAA, right? Their privacy statement, their privacy statement for face and voice is 4 lines long, where USAA, with your permission, will collect your face and your voice data, we'll use it for authentication, we won't give it to anybody else ever, and if you ask us to delete it, we'll do it in 7 days. 4 lines. Now find the privacy statement for Facebook. If you can get it in 4 pages, you're doing very, very well, right? It's deliberately obfuscated. So if we take that approach in the market, then it's a very simple thing, right? And so I think, you know, as we go forward, there's a business for these identity banks to assert my identity on my behalf. And I worry more about Google surveilling me, quite frankly. They know more about what I do every day than my bank does, right? And Amazon and Facebook and Twitter and all these people. And so that's where we have a challenge, not with the biometrics. So.
Can I just say one thing quickly? Because I just want to break it down really simply to answer your question. It depends on the application. It depends on the company you're dealing with. There's no one answer to that question. But biometrics can be generated for one-time tokens and thrown away. They can be stored on your device. They can be stored in the cloud. They can be, you know, it's data. There's nothing, you can store that data any way you want. You can protect it any way you want. So it's entirely, no, okay, I'm not saying you, I'm saying that it's a piece of data that is managed and stored in different ways, and there's no predefined way, and so yes, you have to be careful about that, right. Well, at this point, the way it's organized depends on the application. It really depends on the application. Okay, I probably have one more question because we're over already, yeah.
It seems that the fingerprint is, at least from a public user standpoint, the first mainstream biometric that we're interacting with. What are your thoughts on, I guess, the secondary or tertiary ways that we'll see it? The iris, is it vein, earlobe?
You mean in terms of like, you know, the customer applications because we're all doing this on our phones?
And it was available because the phone.
Right, right. Okay, who wants to take that one?
I'll go first because.
Peter can take that on. He did a survey.
Yeah, otherwise.
Survey says.
No, so I agree. The probably most prevalent in use today is fingerprint because it's on a lot of phones. But from our deployments around the world, and we have many of them, they're moving towards, there's no one biometric that works for everybody because it's not on every phone or doesn't work in all conditions. So I would say the primary ones are finger, face, and you've got 2 providers of good face matching technology here today. You have voice, you have iris. The new Samsung Galaxy S8 has a very slick, if you've seen it, the iris recognition. Again, it's device-based. What you're going to see is more and more innovation. You're going to see electrocardiogram as you're holding the phone. It can create a circuit across your heart. You're going to see advances in, you know, in everything from, you know, like I said, iris already, but you make it, you know, well, I don't want to give away any secrets here, but you'll have face, you'll have combined with other things on your face. So you're going to see continuous innovation in that space. And I think we're moving to the point where there's different ways to authenticate humans depending on what device is available. Fingerprint will always be there, but in cars, you're not going to be touching something. It'll be voice, you know, as you're driving, because people are used to speaking. Sitting in front of a smart TV, it'll probably be face or iris or iPrint or something like that. So there's no one. I think there's a whole plethora coming, but fingerprint did kind of start it for the consumer.
Fingerprint sensors were just cheap and easy to put on phones. That's kind of why they started.
I mean, I would argue that faces are going to be the next big thing. I mean, we already know there's going to be a face scanner in the iPhone 8. The reason why faces are going to be huge is that the sensors are ubiquitous. You know, you've got an issue. Where are the sensors? For face, the answer is everywhere, because every single personal device has a front-facing camera. The second reason is that it's, from a usability point of view, it just doesn't get simpler. Earlobes, for example, are an awful problem because you feel like a complete idiot going and shoving your phone out here, and it's also very difficult to align. So from a usability point of view, earlobes are awkward. The third reason for faces is there is enormous informational complexity in a face. And by doing what we do, for example, which is to illuminate the face, you can add further complexity. That enables you to discover things about the face. It enables you to protect it against liveness attacks in a way that is impossible now with voice and becoming increasingly difficult now for fingerprints.
Toby, Francis, you want to jump in here?
So I would just say that there's no one size fits all. I've spent my time in face, finger, iris, and now behavior and partnering with voice. So I feel like I've touched it all. And I feel very strongly that there's really no one size fits all. Even with face has its challenges, as does every single biometric. So it's really understanding the problem that you're trying to solve, the use case that you're trying to fit into, and then maybe it's one biometric, maybe it's a combination of biometrics. But there's one thing I can say is that whatever it is, it has to be seamless experience to the user. So sometimes face is the most seamless because, we take our pictures naturally and we're doing that. Sometimes it's fingerprint, sometimes it's something passive.
Okay, and with that, we're going to wrap up, and I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today, and maybe the panel will be around if anybody has any questions up front. Thanks so much.